I think it is an interesting story, and US manufacturing is on the up, whereas Australian manufacturing, I think, is struggling. So are there any lessons that we can learn from the American experience? And we have an Australian panel to discuss that, and as good a panel as you'd ever get. Ines Willox, the Group Chief of Australian Industry Group, the John Pollaers, the Chief Executive Officer of Pacific Brands and Chair of the recently established Advanced Manufacturing Council Australia, and John Daley, Dr. John Daley, who's Chief Executive of the Grattan Institute, who's done a lot of work on education and innovation and how that can contribute to a stronger manufacturing sector in Australia. So I would ask them to join me on the stage. John, yeah. So we'll get straight into it. I'll invite you just to make a few comments, and obviously you'll be reflecting on the Australian situation, but I wouldn't mind you to comment on your reaction to what has been attempted in the US. Now, I know it's not the full story. They didn't say anything about the cheap price of gas and other inputs and so forth, but that is attributed to not just the lack of shale fracking, but also to public policy and how it's been implemented. So I think, what do you think? John, you want to start first?
Start with a few comments. Yeah, firstly, I'm delighted that this is on the agenda at this event. I think point was made earlier on today of the expanding agenda in the Alliance, and I think this is a very important part because we genuinely have a lot to learn from the American effort on this front. One of the great challenges I think we have is that manufacturing as a concept is no longer what it used to be, and people don't understand what manufacturing is today. And effectively, a more modern definition is it's innovation and the commercialisation of innovation, in the creation there of products and services to support that commercialisation. And the Americans, I think, have landed that concept. They understand it, whereas we are tending still to think of it as depressed industries in production. Mm. One of the things that I think that we can learn from the American effort is the way that they've pulled together a framework to engage industry. They've involved CEOs, which is exactly what the Advanced Manufacturing Council is doing, making sure that the people who run business are in there and part of the process. But they've recognised that you've got only a certain amount of time to get going because you've got the US, you've got the UK, you've got Germany, you've got Singapore. I was speaking to the Dutch representative government here today. Everybody is now trying to catch up in advanced manufacturing. And the issue I think we have in Australia is that there's lots of speeches that are being peppered with the term advanced manufacturing. Even today, the Trade Minister, for some reason, included in a sentence with aged care. There's no real understanding of the opportunity of it, and unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time. Pacific Brands will be probably my 10th turnaround of a company that size, and invariably the issue in turnarounds is you identify the problem 5 years too late, and then you've got a hell of a lot of catch-up to do, and that's where I think we are on the manufacturing debate in Australia. In 4 years, if we could accomplish what the US has accomplished, we would get ourselves right back on the path.
Thanks very much. Ines, now you look at the industry, across the board, in effect. You have lots of different companies with slightly different interests, but you must draw some more general conclusions from their struggle and have thoughts on how public policy might contribute to a faster take-up of the knowledge economy in Australia and a stronger advanced manufacturing sector.
Well, thanks, Robert. I do think you have a career as a journalist.
No, I don't think so.
It's a work in progress, though. Thank you for all being here. And as John said, I think it is fantastic that this issue is on the agenda because there is much that we can look at and learn from the United States. You think about the United States and its the role of manufacturing within its economy. It has really gone like that. And then since the global financial crisis and the sort of the serendipitous discovery of shale gas and you put those two together, manufacturing as a component of its economy is on a quite steady and steep incline, whereas Australia, manufacturing has gone like this, and now it's going through a sort of that sort of period, and we need to work out whether it's going to fall off the cliff or to become a core component, an even more core component of our industrial base. And advanced manufacturing is really where we're going to go, and we play a part as the organisation that John is very happily chairing, the Advanced Manufacturing Council, in sort of helping drive that. And part of that is to put CEOs at the forefront of that, because they are the ones who understand and know best about what's happening. So I think manufacturing in Australia has a perception problem, a problem that is based around old think, around smokestacks, sort of Dickensian type conditions. Those sort of issues come up all the time. In fact, what manufacturing does, when you think about it, it comprises about 9% of our GDP, but about 25% of our R&D is in manufacturing. That is what's important. That's where the growth of the future goes. Those sort of old perceptions are just that old. There is an issue that we need to face up to, and it's an issue that people like the Reserve Bank are focused on incredibly intently in Australia, is to get investment back into manufacturing. So how do we get investment into manufacturing? And that is the key issue that we have in Australia. And to do that, we have to identify and find areas of comparative and competitive advantage. Now, the days of us sort of mass producing everything under the sun are, quite frankly, if not gone, they're disappearing. We have to be much smarter about what we do. A person working, there was a tactic, unfortunately, among some in the union movement to talk about employee numbers in manufacturing. Those days are changing. We're becoming much more reliant on automation and robotics. A person working in manufacturing now is going to be very highly skilled, technically advanced in terms of their understanding, global in their thinking and their outreach. They're more likely to have a computer mouse than a spanner in their hands. That's the way where manufacturing is going. Now, we might be an 80% services economy, and there might be an increase in resources sector, which is a component of our economy, but you still need manufacturing at the core of that economy to help drive that resources sector with the investment and the products that they need, to help drive that services sector. It's all right to have a services sector, but you've always got to ask your question, what are they servicing? Servicing what? When you think about manufacturing, it has a job multiplier of about 5 to 1. For every manufacturing job, it creates about another 5 jobs. And that's sort of where we're looking at the moment, is where do we find that comparative advantage going forward? What are our competitive strengths? We have the resources base. We have areas like water. We're renowned for being clean and green in food processing and the like. We are on the back door of the emerging middle class of Asia, where we're expected to have about 3 billion people who are going to be able to buy substantial product within the next 20 years. That's where our competitive advantage is. Now, the United States has found itself with competitive advantages, particularly around shale and particularly around cost. It's moved its manufacturing base generally to the south. We have to find our own competitive advantage. We are losing competitive advantages around areas like energy, gas. I see Tony Woods here, and Tony will have great views on gas. But these are things that we need to look at as we try to identify that comparative advantage into the future. I think you have to be relentlessly optimistic about Australia's industrial base, because we need one if we are to grow in a balanced and sustainable way as a national economy. In my finishing remarks, I'll finish with this thought. The United States went through a global financial crisis. We missed it in many ways. We were through either good luck, dumb luck, or good policy, or well-planned, well-thought-out policy. In many ways, we are now going through our own version of the global financial crisis within Australia. With our high cost base, we are now the 4th most expensive country in the world in which to do business, and according to the World Bank, and the other three. One is Bermuda, and that doesn't really count, and the other two are Nordics with their different cost base. We have to now go through this period of quite difficult structural change, but at the heart of it, manufacturing must be a key component, but it will more likely than not be a different form of manufacturing to the type of manufacturing that you thought of when you were growing up.
It's an interesting perception that there's no doubt that the recession in the US did cause a lot of sort of self-analysis, and it was quite shattering experience. The first reaction was to blame others, China in particular, jobs being transported to China. But then, in a typical US way, they seem to sort of settle down and say, well, just what can we do to help ourselves? And according to the video, leadership played quite a part in inspiring a new direction. But John, you spend a lot of time looking at the issue of how education, training, and the video picked up this issue of labour skills, appropriate labour skills. How do you think that Australia is going in that area, and do you think we, from a point of view of education and training, are we heading in the right direction?
Well, I think we first probably need to put this problem of manufacturing and innovation into context. It's worth remembering that manufacturing is actually a relatively small part of the Australian economy, about 9%, and also a declining share of consumption. So the things that we actually as individuals wind up consuming are increasingly services, and that's a trend we're seeing across the developed world. Essentially, there's only so much stuff you can consume. And then the other thing that I think we've got to put into context around this advanced manufacturing area is that of the things that we consume in Australia, about 83% of them are produced here. And therefore the key issue is not so much is the Australian business competing on a global stage. Actually, 83% of what we do is not competing on a global stage. The key issue is how productive is it within Australia. Now, of course, there's then 17% that is internationally competitive that we do have to worry about. Then the second thing I think it's worth bringing to play is what are the real trends in Australia and what are the global trends? And the short answer is that manufacturing has been a declining share of both production and consumption around the world for about the last 50 years. And again, I think that's reflecting global trends that people, as they become richer, spend more of their money on fundamentally what we describe today as services. So a global trend, and yes, manufacturing is smaller in Australia, but I would suggest we would expect it to be smaller. Australia is not only a small country, but it's a country a very long way away from any large market. People have pointed out, it's worth remembering that Beijing is actually closer to Berlin than it is to Brisbane. And so we will always, it is very unlikely that Australia is ever going to have a manufacturing sector large by global standards. Doesn't mean that we'll have none, but it doesn't mean that it's likely to be large. Now that said, although there's this perception that Australian manufacturing is doing incredibly badly and has been completely knocked around by the mining boom and all the rest of it, when you actually look at Australian manufacturing exports, that is absolutely true for low-end manufacturing. And indeed, that's what you'd expect. Australia's become a very high GDP per capita country. We are one of the richest countries in the world. By definition, that flows through into wages, or at least one hopes it flows through into wages, and therefore, inherently, we are a high-cost country. And I would suggest that is a good thing. It goes with being a high-income country. So it's not surprising that we've seen low-end manufacturing exports falling very rapidly over the last decade. But we've also simultaneously seen high-end manufacture exports, at least in value terms, in volume terms, increase by about 50% between 2002 and 2009. That's not a statistic that you read very often. And then have been flat more or less since about 2009, which, given the strength of the Australian dollar, is hardly surprising. This has been a very difficult place to export from for the last 4 years. But then, although the public narrative is, manufacturing is kind of dying in Australia, the reality is it's actually holding up despite a dollar which is high by any kind of standards. So then it does lead us to the question, okay, given all that background, what can we do from a policy perspective? And then obviously you do get pushed to this question of education very quickly. It's the one, if you like, positive sum game there is. I guess where I'd start on Australian schools is to say, I'd rather be starting with Australian schools than American schools. The bottom line is that the United States school education system is now, if you're lucky, middle of the pack by OECD standards, and certainly falling behind. Australian schools are at least in the top third. They're probably falling behind a bit too, but at least not nearly so badly. And I think that there's an increasing awareness that we need to really focus on the way that we train teachers and then provide them with feedback and then consistently performance manage them and provide performance feedback to them over their careers to really do a lot better on that. And then there's Australian universities. And here again, I'd actually suggest, I remember when I was 25 years ago and first did a little bit of work in education policy, we always thought about, well, there's the US higher education system over here, and there was the Australian, big mass higher education system, incredibly successful, and there was then the Australian higher education system, small, elite, very different. And what I think we may well have missed in Australia over the last 25 years is that picture has actually changed radically. If you look at school leavers in Australia, we now have almost the same percentage going to higher education than in the United States. And although the data is not good, and although, of course, the very top of American higher education is incredibly good, the middle and bottom is, to be blunt, not always fabulous, and indeed not obviously more fabulous than what you can get in Australia. And I think the middle and bottom of our higher education system is actually doing pretty well by global standards. And as I said, picking up a large number of students, indeed about the same kind of participation rates that we're seeing in the United States, and interestingly, much, much better completion rates. So far more people actually succeeding in finishing a degree, which presumably then means they've got a bit more to take out into the workforce. So you put this problem in context. Our education system is doing well, and of course the education system matters partly because of manufacturing, but 91% because of everything else. Ultimately our prosperity as a country depends on the productivity of the entire economy. Doesn't depend on our exports, it depends on the productivity of the entire economy, and that is what education does most to affect. And I think that that's probably the place to really focus, is what's the quality of education across the board, both in our schools and in our higher education. And if that helps manufacturing, of course, that's terrific. But I'd be very disappointed if we thought that was the primary reason we were doing it. The reality is I would suggest we're doing it for much broader reasons.
Well, I think the US has acknowledged it needs to improve its education system, apart from the elite institutions. He talked about it in general terms, but if to use his language, if you dove down a bit further, you'd find that a considerable emphasis is being put on that. But so Australia's so it's comforting if you say we're actually doing better than what we thought we were on the education side. So we've got to look at other factors, and I think we've got to acknowledge that we are a higher cost economy than the US, and our labour costs will be higher probably for some time.
I hope
we would hope they would stay in terms of it being a sign of success, but it's also a sign of challenge when you're competing in a global environment.
Nobody's suggesting that we need to be a low-cost economy to achieve what we need to achieve.
No, I don't think anybody is suggesting. In fact, that's the challenge, isn't it? How can we, within
that
our parameters, be more successful in this sector?
Yeah. Look, we have some issues that have emerged historically here when you compare us to the United States. The United States has that tradition much more strongly than Australia, perhaps because of the way that kids leave home and go to college, of those links between business and colleges. So in Australia we have the fairly unfortunate statistic, according to data that we produced in 2012, that only 5% of Australian businesses have an ongoing substantial link with publicly funded research institutions or universities. There just isn't that link there, and that's something that if we had to develop our economy further and our manufacturing further, that we really need to do, because there is untapped expertise. The other issue is that although we do very well in education, I'll just throw it out there, it's education of what and in what. And that is the big question that will go to our economic base going forward. And you see it emerging now more and more. There was a piece in the Financial Review this morning, I think it was a KPMG report, about how we are going to start to fall short of the skills that we need for the future, be those ICT skills, where we're told reliably that 70% of the jobs of the future are going to be, and yet we have declining ICT study rates in Australia. Those STEM skills, science, technical education and mathematics, where we continue to slip down the global tables. Language skills as well. So these are the areas that we need to look at, is that sense of collaboration and that sense of educational purpose, and that's where government policy is crucial. And there is clearly a role for government to set, as the chap said in the video, to set the framework and the parameters. But at the end of the day, it's business itself that's got to find products that work and markets that work, and that's what it comes down to.
If I could comment on that also, Robert, I think that I often find that when this conversation ends up in the area of wage rates and education, that what we're doing is we're pushing the problem out 5-10 years to solve. And to John's point, right now there are about 2,500 manufacturing businesses that are occupying that top 50% that are all growing. They're all small to medium enterprises, and there's no real dialogue with them to say, well, what do you need this year and next year to double your employment? What do you need this year and next year to open up a market? Instead, it's often dominated by a conversation around those large manufacturers that are in trouble. Right. And then when you look at the education debate, to Innes's point, there's no doubt in the long term we've got to get those basic skills back up. But for those people who are ready to enter into employment, there's no internships at the moment. There's a very poorly developed internship mindset in Australia. It's very hard unless you're going to go into banking or law or into a service economy. There's not enough internships in the area of manufacturing or in the creative spaces to enable people who are at university to sort of take some of those skills into the areas that we're talking about. So I think it really has to be from my point of view as a businessman, I'd much rather these conversations, start with what can we do in the next 3 years so we know we'll get an outcome in the next 5, and then those longer term conversations definitely need to happen. But I think we've got the priority the wrong way around.
So you've obviously, in setting up the Advanced Manufacturing Council, decided that the business community itself, with an interest in this subject, should join together and presumably lobby. What do you lobby for? What are you looking for from government?
Well, I think the first step in setting up the council has been to say, what can business do for itself?
It's a good start.
To say, that we all run businesses that invest. We're capable of finding the recruits and the skills that we need when we need them. And if you look at Australian industry, Andrew's a very interesting guy, Andrew Liveris. If I take Andrew as an example of an industry leader who's stepped out there and is driving change. I think what we're looking at...
from a boy from Darwin, is it?
Yeah, that's right.
Now chairman of the American Business Council,
yeah. And
telling Obama how he should develop his policies.
Yeah, and Australians do tend to be vocal overseas, but we want them to be more vocal in Australia and to make a case for why investment in their business is important and why in their industry is important, and therefore why, when they require or need government input in some kind, why the case is a good case, as opposed to just a transition from a bad situation to a better one. And so the council is there to make sure, firstly, that the CEOs come together and have the kind of dialogue that AMP has had, to have a conversation with government to say, look, if you're going to have a holistic approach to advanced manufacturing strategy, to make that distinction, then you do have to consider taxation, regulation, infrastructure, education. It's got to be holistic. And we need to make sure all the government ministries are lined up along those areas. And one of the nice things about the American approach has been, the formation of the Advanced Manufacturing Partnership the National Program Office, which will look to see that things are happening. And the way in which they've lined up across all of the agencies, everybody's got something that some policy position
Agencies
that's
have got to
coordinated
account for how they're
in
contributing.
each of them.
Yeah.
We don't have any single person to speak to. Even the Brits have the business secretary, and so it's very difficult for us to have a dialogue with any of the governments because the remits that impact advanced manufacturing are spread so broadly. And in fact, if you're generous and you look at the policies that are currently in place, you can see elements of an advanced manufacturing strategy and policy. It's just not packaged in a way that people are clear on the outcomes and therefore accountable for the outcomes. So really what we want to do is make sure there's a more holistic approach by stepping up the leadership of CEOs in this space.
Robert, can I just...
And then from government? Well, you can
Well, I was
answer.
just going to say that that's why we're so
Because
keen...
your organisation has been
why we're so
pressing
keen
for
on
this council.
supporting this council and providing a lot of support to this council and helping establish it, but it has to be CEO-led, is that essentially you've got to look at the issue with a couple of different perspectives. Since the global financial crisis, manufacturing's lost 7% of the employment within Australia. So do you look at it as being 7%, the glass being 7% half empty or 93% full? How do you look at it? And then you look at other issues like the demise of the automotive sector in Australia. Now, I made the point on behalf of my organisation that was sad but inevitable for a whole range of reasons that was going to happen in Australia. But what we have to do now is two things. We need to look at the over 3,000 companies in those supply chains of those automotive companies and see how they transition. Now, just keep in mind that 40% of Australian manufacturers employ less than 10 people. It's a scale issue. So there is going to be natural consolidation occur here that we need to keep in mind. There will be the coming together of different companies, and some will survive and some unfortunately won't. And that's the reality. So how do we make that transition? And the reason that the change in the automotive sector is so important is because it did in many ways have a distortionary impact on perception and on the debate. And I think what's happened as a result of that, and in many ways the government has picked up the rhetoric of business, that the days of handouts are over. You can't rely on that. If you compete, you have to compete on your products or on your markets, on your smarts, and you need to be able to find products and markets that work, and that's what's so important. So there is a role for government here to assist industry around the sort of policies that we've been talking about innovation, around taxation, around assistance with R&D, so that we can compete on a global scale, but perhaps not at everything. But we need to find the things that we're very good at, and there will still be from that a flow out of things that we have to do in Australia. That because our market is here, we're close to market. So it's a matter now of getting that balance right within Australia, and so we're going through this sort of crunching time within industry at the same time as our economy is going through quite a substantial change. So, things won't be as they were before, but we're coming back to the United States. We look at the United States as an example. The big advantage that the United States has is energy policy. The big disadvantage that we have at the moment is energy policy. And I'm not broaching any secrets here when I tell you that I could give you a dozen major companies in Australia who are looking in the winter of 2016 at shutting down their operations in New South Wales, quite frankly, because they won't have gas contracts or just won't be able to pay for it. And that's sort of the future that we face, and that's the train coming down the track that we need to get ready for, and that's why it's important that we act now to find those competitive advantages.
Well, that will require government policy, won't it?
Possibly, Robert. I think
government policy in the sense that the restrictions on expanding coal seam gas in both Victoria and New South Wales, government-imposed restrictions, are meaning that there is less competition in the gas industry.
There is a role for
prices
government.
are high.
There has to be a role for government, given the way that our federation has established that our business frameworks are in place.
Well, I think
John?
possibly. As I think Tony's report for Grattan on gas laid out very clearly. The key issue with those gas contracts and with the availability or otherwise of gas in New South Wales is primarily around certainty. At the point that everybody, both manufacturers and gas producers, think that there is a distinct possibility that government might intervene to either help them or help the other side, it's very difficult to get long-run contracts written. Because with that uncertainty hanging over, it's the completely logical response is to basically, not commit to anything long term. I think the key thing that government needs to do is be very clear about whether coal seam gas is going to happen or not in New South Wales. And in some ways, the most important thing to do is to make a decision as opposed to anything else. And then secondly, to also be very clear about the extent to which government is or is not going to intervene otherwise in the gas market around, for example, reservation and so on. And at the point that there is total clarity that what government is and is not going to do, certainly our analysis at Grattan Institute would suggest we will probably see a lot more certainty for those corporates, particularly in 2016. Because the bottom line is, if you're prepared to pay for the gas, then the people who would otherwise export it are probably going to sell it to you in Australia if you're prepared to pay for it. And the real issue at the moment is that people aren't prepared to write those long-term contracts because of the very government uncertainty that's hanging over the entire market. And that's what needs to get resolved.
I think we'll have a debate on that in a minute.
There seems to be certainty that they're not doing anything.
Yeah, I like certainty, but I like the right decisions too.
Yeah.
There are two. Before we bring the audience in, there are two issues I just want you to touch on. We have to touch on clusters. Do you believe that they're useful, and is there a role for government? We have CRCs in Australia. We haven't had anything quite like what they're doing under the American Advanced Manufacturing Partnership. Do you have a view on that subject?
Yeah, I think they are very important, and I think particularly in Australia where we have such a small population base and spread out over such a long distance, getting the like-minded businesses and people into similar locations does make a difference. I lived in Singapore for a long time and watched the way their biotech industry evolved once they decided to set up, what they think they call it a biopolis. I look at how well cochlear implants are doing based on the Macquarie University site and the way that they're working together with research facilities there. Recently, Pacific Brands started working with the CSIRO and hadn't understood what was available to us if we, provided we invest a certain amount of money, all of a sudden the doors open up. And when those doors open up, there was an amazing array of developments that we could co-invest in and work with. So I'm personally in favour of taking something like the CIRO, the existing university base that we have, and somehow building around those centres of excellence rather than this creation of new precincts or new CRCs or so forth. Yeah.
Innes?
I need to disclose here I've got an interview next week because we're part of the Advanced Manufacturing CRC putting that together, and which will be government funded. But yes, there is a role for clusters, but there need to be industry-led clusters. Industry doesn't know all that it needs, but it knows a lot of what it needs in terms of the relationships with those publicly funded institutions and like the CSIRO and universities. It's about a clustering of ideas and a clustering of expertise. And part of the issue in Australia has been that disparate manufacturing base that I mentioned before, relatively small scale and quite spread out. So it's about, in many ways, trying to change or invoke cultural change within Australia. And that's where clustering is important. That's where that sort of CRC role that we are part of, we think is very important, but it's to put industry at the front and centre so that researchers are able to collaborate directly with industry and industry with researchers. We've missed that in the past.
Yeah. I think in the American experience, it is much more industry-driven.
Absolutely.
The Australian experience, and I'm a strong supporter of CRCs and I chair one, is that although we say they're industry-driven, they tend to be research-driven. It's the researchers that find the industry.
Flipped on
in the US, it's the industry that finds the researchers, and then the government provides a framework around it and a bit of bit of support.
Super.
John, what do you
And,
think?
well, I think that's absolutely right. And the track record, there's a lovely piece of analysis that's been done about clusters around the world, and a grand total of, out of 186, is one of them, namely the Taiwanese industry, Taiwanese semiconductor industry that we always hear about. One was government-driven, and the remaining 185 were industry-pulled. So your chances of success for a government-driven one are not high, and I think there's certainly some evidence of Singapore. Yes, it has spent an awful lot of money trying to create a biotechnology cluster. It's not immediately obvious that the Singaporean economy is getting its money back. So I think absolutely must be industry pulled, and in that sense, not too much government money is a very good idea, because it does focus the industry mind if a lot of the money goes in.
And there's not too much money in the US model,
interestingly. It does focus the mind when it's your own money. And then I think the third thing that's worth remembering is that there is quite a big opportunity here. One of the, our image of Australia is that it's a really big, spread out place. And yes, there's a lot of map, but as a country, we have a greater percentage of our population living in really big cities than pretty much any other country in the world, certainly any other country other than a sort of Singapore, which is basically a city-state. So we have very large cities by global standards. So if you look at Melbourne and Sydney, they are larger than any city in France or Germany bar Paris. So they are big cities by global standards. And a very large percentage of the Australian population fundamentally lives in Brisbane, Melbourne, Sydney and Perth. And that's the opportunity that really we've already got the right geography. The question now is what industries does it make sense? Where do we have a comparative advantage? I suspect a lot of that will actually be around mining and agricultural services and things that for one reason or another lie around the edges of those things.
Well, that was the other issue I was going to raise, and John Pollaers touched on it. Andrew Liveris says, I don't believe in the government should pick winners, but I do believe government should pick sectors. And again, that's what they're doing in the United States, and the one we heard about was a material science area. They've clearly, from a government perspective, and maybe driven by industry, have identified that as a sector into which special attention should be channeled because there's a greater opportunity. Do we believe that for Australia? Some people say, look at our existing areas of competitive advantage, say in mining, say in agriculture and in food, say in energy, and government should then have the courage to pick those sectors and within that encourage industry to build its collaborations.
I think the argument is not even picking those sectors. It's essentially saying those are the things that, this is not like we're trying to pick horses, while they're still in the barrier. This is us picking horses when, there's three of them mile out in front,
right.
most of the way down the home straight.
Yeah, I agree with that. If you look at the CSRA, I believe, have divided themselves up into 6 areas because there's already movement there, to your point.
They're constantly changing, right?
Yeah, but every time I see a list
Constant restructure
of the areas of advantage, the same types of things are always showing up. So I think it is really a case now of saying, out of the 10 things that are on the list, there's 4 or 5 of them that are no-brainers. Let's just get going. But I think there's already some evidence to show.
I think it's fairly obvious where our areas of competitive advantage are, and government should quite rightly focus there. But at the same time, you just never know what's around the corner, and that's where the frameworks are important. I mean, who would have? I was living in America in 2006, and nobody had heard of shale gas, and up and popped, and it sort of has transformed their economy. So that's where the overall settings are very important, so that industry can take advantage of opportunities either that are, if I put it this way, God-given or sort of found, that the industry can take advantage of those opportunities. That's where it's important. But at the same time, it's pretty obvious where our competitive strengths are.
And there's another point, Rob, just to make, is that in the AMP work, what they're doing is they're creating 8 to 15 areas of excellence within advanced manufacturing. What we're talking about is the 5 or 6 areas of competitive advantage for Australia that can also be hubbed. Yeah. But I think for advanced manufacturing to really get the leg up in Australia, we should break it down the next level and say, well, where are the areas there that we see? Is it additive in additive technology? Is it connectivity between systems? Is it, what is the area that's going to make a difference here?
Okay, let's get some interaction, maybe on gas prices. Who wants to start? Yep. Surprise, surprise.
One right up the back.
Yep, and then we'll go right up the back.
Robert, I was going to try and resist, but I couldn't. I think the thing I'd reflect on is how the two countries got to where we are, in a sense, and that the United States didn't start by creating a subsidy for gas in the United States. In fact, as someone pointed out earlier today, gas prices were very high in the United States not many years ago, and the US was looking to import gas. What happened was those market pressures worked together with technologies, and now we've seen what's happened. And as a consequence of extraordinary amount of supply coming into the market, prices, guess what, came down, and you saw as what Innes has been talking about. There is some suggestion that those prices aren't going to stay there much longer. And the US, as far as I can see, isn't fundamentally subsidising manufacturing. What it's doing so far is seeing the benefits of that, and then we'll start to see the US exporting. Now, the other difference with Australia, of course, is that we'll end up exporting 90% of the gas we produce, and the US exports, even if all the gas it's talking about gets exported, it'll be less than 10%. So a fundamentally different industry structure we're talking about. And in an Australian context, it is certainly true, if you've been sitting on the east coast of Australia paying $3 or $4 a gigajoule for your gas for the last 30 or 40 years, and now you're looking at very difficult contractual arrangements which are a combination of term and price much, much higher, this is a hard place to be in the short term. There's no question about that. What do you do about it? Is the question, I think. And then how do you...
Well, is it true that we're the only country in the world that doesn't have some form of reservation on natural gas for domestic purposes?
No, I don't think
that's what I've been
true.
told.
Anyway,
they could all be wrong and we could be right.
I'd also just remind you one other thing that Andrew Robb pointed out in his presentation. I think he used the word sailed through several times in relation to the 3% growth. It all started, the opportunity for Australia to do that was when we liberalised trade, and I think going back to restricting trade would be exactly the wrong thing for us to be thinking about.
Okay, John.
I was just going to point out we may well be the only country that doesn't reserve gas. I note that we are also the country in the world that is most rapidly expanding its gas production by quite some margin, given all the things we've been talking about earlier today.
I'll just make the point. I better butt in.
Yeah.
It's all well and good, and we're all for expanding our gas production. But unfortunately, what is happening is because of the export contracts, and people will hail me down here, it's all being sucked off overseas. We're diminishing capacity here for domestic use, be that industrial or household. Our prices have gone up as a result of this, and that is an impacting on our competitiveness going forward. And in fact, it's going to the very heart of the life and death of many industries and companies in Australia, where we did at one stage have a comparative advantage, and now we don't for a whole variety of reasons. And I just think we need to be aware of the consequences. This doesn't have to be an all or nothing argument here. We don't need to say, oh, well, I'm just paraphrasing you here, we're just exporting it all, that's good for the country, but what is the impact of that back here on our competitiveness? And that's the big issue that we need to address, because it is having very significant impacts on future investment down the track and on growth and competitive prospects in Australia here now.
And John, we boast that we're about to pass Qatar as the world's largest natural gas exporter. That's because Qatar has now put a ceiling on its exports because it believes it can gain greater value by using the gas above the ceiling for manufacturing and to add greater value.
Well, I wish them...
I want to go to a question right down the back.
Chris Skinner, and I'm speaking mostly on behalf of the Warren Centre for Advanced Engineering. I'd like to go back to the first half of the subject, which is the knowledge economy, and note in passing about gas that our Prime Minister stood up in Houston the other day and said that Australia was comparable to the US in terms of energy availability. So I really think it's rather unhelpful to be spending so much time worrying about that score. All of the speakers have commented on competitive advantage. We have some very real competitive advantages in the knowledge economy. For example, the Australian Centre for Field Robotics at the University of Sydney, which is responsible for driverless vehicles, both trucks and trains, for the resources industry, is considered the world leader in this field, and we need to exploit that. Secondly, the University of South Australia and the Institute of Telecommunications Research has spun off a company called Coda Wireless, Coda spelt ad hoc backwards, which is the sort of thing that those sort of geeks do. They are the world leader in producing the radio sets that will enable vehicles, road vehicles, to avoid hitting each other by talking directly from one to the other. David Thodey, who runs Telstra, is looking forward to 5G and the Internet of Things and machine-to-machine capabilities. Australia has real competitive advantage in all three of those areas, and I'd like to hear what the panel has to say about how we exploit them.
Well, Chris,
There we go.
I couldn't agree more. I think, firstly, if it's the Chris Skinner that I think it is recognising your voice, is one of the finest men I've ever had the privilege to serve under in the Navy. But Chris, I agree entirely. I think I'm very optimistic around the future for Australia in this space. If we can get more of those stories told and we can get this machinery behind supporting it, because we have fantastic, basic, we have great education, we have great engineers, we've got some great institutions, but what we haven't had is an agenda to drive it. And what we haven't had is anybody step up and say, this is what I want this to look like in 10, 15 years' time. This is the contribution I want this kind of advancement to make to the economy in that time frame. And the thing that we hope to do as part of the council is to get as many of those examples on the table with government as possible to start to work out how we get behind the momentum rather than drag us into areas we're not currently operating in. But I'd love to hear more about those examples.
Cochlear was another example was mentioned earlier today.
Yeah.
I think we're all in furious agreement here. We have tremendous resources in Australia. We have tremendous expertise. Our institutions do very well. It's about the next stage of then developing what is occurring in those institutions and getting that collaboration going. We're very good in Australia at hiding our light under a bushel. We don't talk ourselves up about what we can do, but this is where the role of government isn't about government meddling. It's about actually government setting the vision, the V word, about what they want the economy to broadly look like in terms of its makeup and how it should be, how it should, a pathway should be able for it to be developed into the future. That's where the role of government is. We have all the ingredients here to make a terrific recipe. I think the point we're trying to make here is it's just going to be a different recipe to the one that we made maybe 30 years ago.
Any other questions? Yes, up here.
Tom Worthington from the Research School of Computer Science at the Australian National University. There was mention of education and costs and ICT education there before. I'd just like to ask the panel, are you sure you're not falling into the trap of thinking Australia and the US can agree to keep doing the way they do education in the past and miss the revolution in education that's now happening online, and that there's a risk that the infrastructure we have is about to be rendered obsolete, and we need to compete with the rest of the world?
Come on, John, this is right down your alley.
All right. Look, I'd be very surprised if in 100 years' time there aren't still students on campuses. On the other hand, I'd be very surprised if in 10 years' time there aren't lots more students than there are today studying online. And I think what we are already seeing is the rise of so-called blended education. So far more in the way of higher education courses that to some extent have students who come on campus and to some extent have those students who also receive some of their education one way or another online. One thing we do know about online higher education is that completion rates for people who have never done any other higher education are actually very low. So it's very difficult as a student to stay motivated if the only place you go is to your own bedroom to kind of sit there and type online. And to do that for three years in a row and complete an entire higher education course requires a self-discipline that very, very, very few students have.
It's very
got.
unhealthy too.
Not to mention unhealthy. So my guess is that we will...
the social skills, the interaction.
Yeah. We'll see the rise of blended higher education, as we already are. I think it does have some implications. I suspect we will see a lot more of what you might think of as the traditional lecture migrate to a much more online experience. And that will have big ramifications for universities, because if you are, for example, teaching Chemistry 101, there aren't that many differences between Chemistry 101 at Melbourne or Melbourne University, the University of Southern Queensland, Harvard and University of Phoenix. Roughly speaking, the content will be the same. And what that means is whoever is really, really, really good at teaching Chemistry 101 will wind up setting up a terrific online course, and that will win. So at least in that kind, it's the equivalent of taking what used to be the textbook game, which tended to have only 3 or 4 winners, and instead the lecturing game will only have 3 or 4 winners. And that, of course, will be a pretty radical shift for higher education over the long run. That said, I think the rest of a lot of what goes on in higher education institutions, so if you like, roughly speaking, the tutorial experience, will probably remain quite similar, particularly because that piece around student interaction for many, many students, not all of them, but many of them, will remain really important. So yes, higher education is transforming. Yes, the online part of it will be really important to that. Some parts of it will change quite radically, but my guess is, as I said, we're going to be seeing physical university campuses and students on them for quite a while.
Let's make a point here, and I hate to always be informed by personal experience, but I was at Melbourne Uni yesterday and I was caught up with my son, who today finishes his Masters in International Relations. So we had the what's next conversation, maybe a bit late for a father to have that with his son. But
never too late. He might end up in the Australian industry group.
But it was really interesting to me. He said, what I'm going to do next week is start a course at Stanford online. I thought, this is interesting. And it was one of those, it's a Coursera thing or a MOOCs thing. But that's the way things are going. Now, the question I have about that, and I'm all for it, is who is the horse and who is the cart here? Because if this is the way that universities and colleges around the world are going, who's driving the demand here? Are they putting it out there as a they will come, or are the students in turn going to be the ones who drive what universities deliver? And that then leads me to the discussion we have within Australia around our own vocational education and training sector, which has been very much demand-led in the past rather than industry-led. And that's how you've ended up with a plethora of hairdressers and gym and personal trainers rather than the welders and the engineers that we need for our future economy. So I think education is going through a very similar sort of transformation to which other parts of our economy is going, and that's all being led by technology. You've got to remember, when we're talking about manufacturing, we're talking about a lot of this being technology-led and enforced change, and education is going through the same changes. So, I mean, if my kid thinks nothing about going and doing a course at Stanford, either one way or the other, the rest of the world is going to be thinking the same way too, which is going to put enormous pressures on our universities here to compete and to be regarded at the very best in the same way, not at everything, but at some quite specific things.
John, do you think the really smart industry, say the Googles, will ultimately develop their own universities and teach the kids the way they want them to think?
To some extent they already are, although I suspect they'll wind up intervening in some of these core courses that are, as I said, this will be a winner-takes-all game, at least in terms of delivering the online lecture experience. And I suspect they'll be very interested in contributing to that, because that's the point of maximum leverage, and that's where they can have a real impact. As I said though, I think that the physical campus will be here for a long time. I note your son is a graduate of a master's course at a very respectable university. That's the minority, and yes, same thing at Grattan Institute. We have any number of our employees who are all busy off doing Coursera courses and having a lovely time, but they are not the average student sample.
Another question? We've got time for a couple more questions. We'll give ourselves a slightly longer afternoon tea. Where are we?
Garrett.
Yep. Oh, yep.
Boy, hard for me to resist jumping in on the education debate, but I will, since one sense of advertising, Wharton is the leading MOOC provider in the world with 1.5 million students enrolled in Coursera last year. Thus ends the ad. But I want to ask the panel about a really interesting op-ed that Mike Spence, the Nobel Prize winner, not the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Sydney, wrote last week, saying that the real challenge for the world is that the two greatest innovations are 3D printing and robotics, and the problem is that no one will be employed in a world in which you can 3D print anything you like and robots will assemble it. Where are the jobs in that world?
This is the great social challenge that we face, Jeff, and you've just hit on it. That's what I touched on before. We're going down a path of robotics and automation. Manufacturing, which was a big soaker-upper of unskilled labour, will have less need for that in the future, quite frankly, as it becomes more highly skilled, more advanced and more developed. We already have a situation where, according to official data, 40% of our workforce is sort of workforce illiterate or enumerate. That means they can read and write, but they can't do it very well. And manufacturing was an area that picked these people up in the past. Not wholly and solely, but did. The question then is what happens to those people, and that's where the education debate becomes absolutely crucial. Not just around language literacy and numeracy, but then about the next stage, about whether Certificate 2 qualifications are enough to get you anywhere in the world. You've got to get to 3 or 4, or 4 more likely than not. So how do you get your population primed for that? And we're seeing and we fear around decisions like the Holden closure, particularly in pockets of South Australia. You go to Adelaide and you talk to my members there, they have deep feels about that development of intergenerational unemployment within sort of key parts of Adelaide, where you're from, Robert, and then what happens to those people? And that's the big societal challenge that we face as we evolve.
And John, you're the expert, but manufacture is not going to... A vibrant manufacturing industry is not going to soak up the same number of employees as in the past. No. And that's what's happened in America. The rate of economic recovery has been faster than the rate of jobs recovery, and those jobs are unlikely to return.
I'll give you one example, which was an Australian-based manufacturer, built a new plant in Port Botany in Sydney, spent $500 million building the plant, formerly employed 170 people. When I went to the opening, it was sort of, you could put a cannon through the place, and it went from 170 people to 6. 6.
Probably with greater productivity.
With greater productivity.
I think, Robert, it's a new world question being asked with a current world view, and I think each of these introductions will create transition issues as we work out what happens with employment, how it moves on. That's never going to be an argument for saying let's not do it, let's not have 3D printing. It'll be we've just got to deal with the consequence of it. And I often look at my 21-year-old now, and he's not one of those guys like any of our young people now saying, "Oh God, Dad, you guys have worked through all the opportunities. There's nothing left for us." I mean, they're out there, they're working with each other. They talk about collabs now. It's sort of that's their language, and how they get together with other people with different skills to pull ideas together. So I'm again optimistic. I think it's a bit to that point around how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. As these things come in, we're going to have to deal with the consequence, and we're going to have to make education choices, etc. But I am of the view that over time we will start to see. Well, almost Julie Bishop made the point today. We've got no idea what it'll look like in the next 20 years' time. When she made the point about space, intelligence, and cyber, what will evolve. I think will absorb to the extent that it can. But that's why we're on this path with advanced manufacturing to say we want to be in that. We want to be in that debate, not a victim of it.
Right. Well, I've got one last question in the far distance.
I'm Michael Smith from the ANU. One of the speakers mentioned at the start that manufacturing has a bit of an image problem, that it's sort of seen as a declining sector, and this is impacting, right through from attracting the best graduates, getting the investment that some of our successful manufacturers need. I've been lucky enough to do research into different sectors, and I've been stunned at some of the innovative companies out there in Australia, but even those are struggling to get the investment they need to go the next level because of this general perception. So I was just wondering if the panel comment on how can we change Australia's perceptions, how can we change the investment community's perceptions. Do we need an ABC Manufacturing Matters weekly program to get out these sorts of stories, to raise the awareness? And a sort of side question is, what can we do to build venture capital and more entrepreneurship in Australia?
So the lenders in Australia have traditionally been more risk averse than in the United States. Is there any change? Is there anything?
Well, Robert, all I can say is on behalf of Australian Industry Group members, it is the common refrain is that our lending institutions, particularly our banks, are becoming more risk averse, less willing to loan, to make provisions for manufacturing companies, in part because of that perception that it's either dead or dying. They read the same headlines as everyone else, so you see, you think about a Holden going, and then that everything's gone, and then that begins to eat itself, and that's what happens. So I also sit on the board of Innovation Australia, and part of what we're trying to do is to develop at least the debate around venture capital within Australia, very small venture capital pools within Australia compared to the United States. So how do we attract that here? How do we develop our own sense of venture capital and risk-taking? How do we develop an angel funding capability? Are we looking at things like crowdsource funding as well? Other alternative mechanisms for businesses to raise money. And I think what will happen, going to this John's point, is that as our younger generation get together in sort of smaller groups and do their collabs, and they're looking for new opportunities, and they are relentlessly optimistic, they will look for new sources of investment. So one will lead to another. But right at the moment, those sort of traditional businesses with the high fixed costs that are sort of have invested a lot historically in plant and equipment are just finding it very tough to raise capital. I went to a dinner on Monday night in Victoria, the Victorian Manufacturing Hall of Fame, and they gave 2 Life Achievement Awards to 2 guys in their 80s. And they sat up there and they talked on the stage for about 10 minutes, and they're in their 80s, and I have never heard 2 more unbelievably optimistic people in my life, because what they've done is confront challenges their whole way through and think things through the whole way through, found those new markets, found those new products. And they don't think they know everything, but they were just amazingly outward looking and forward thinking in what they were trying to do at 80 and 80 plus, and that's what gives you the confidence in the future. It's about sharing that with the rest of the institutions across our community.
Well, I think that's a good note to finish on, and it's good, John, that there are at least a group of industry contributors in the community who want to attack the problem from what they can do themselves rather than just look to governments, and are going to collaborate and work together, and the fact that ARG has supported them, I think can't be anything but good. So I congratulate you on that as well. And thank you, John. Keep the smarts coming into the debate. And thank you very much for participating in the session.